What am I bid for this maid? Do I hear any offers? 5 guineas.
This is over now. You must let it go. This changes nothing.
The rope was coarse against my wrists. Not tight enough to cut, but tight enough to remind me. I was property. A thing to be sold. Like a cow at Martinmas, like a bushel of rotten wheat that no one wanted but someone might take for the right price. The auctioneer's voice boomed across the village square. Next lot, 1 wife, 23 years of age, sound teeth, good with mending, can read if that matters to any of you. The crowd laughed. 60, maybe 70 people had gathered under the October sky to watch my husband sell me. Yes, sell me. In England, in the year of our Lord 1822, a man could lead his wife to market with a rope around her wrist and sell her to the highest bidder. It was not legal, not truly, but the law looked away, as the law always does when it is a woman who suffers. My husband, George Bly, stood beside the auctioneer with his arms folded and a satisfied smirk on his unshaven face. He had dressed me in my only clean dress, a faded sage green cotton, mended 7 times, because even spoiled goods sell better when they are polished. Starting bid, the auctioneer called. £2. Silence. My cheeks burned. The humiliation was not that I was being sold. The humiliation was that no one wanted to buy me. £1.10 then, the auctioneer said, his voice dropping. More silence. A child somewhere ate an apple loudly, and then from the back of the crowd a voice, quiet, calm like a man ordering tea. £5. Every head turned. I turned too, squinting past the sea of rough faces and market caps. He stood at the edge of the square, leaning against the stone wall of the inn. He wore a plain brown coat, not poor, not rich, simply unremarkable. His hair was dark, almost black, and his eyes were the color of a winter sea. Gray-blue, deep, impossible to read. He was the most beautiful man I had ever seen. And he was buying me. £5, the auctioneer cried, suddenly cheerful. Sold! The stranger walked forward. He did not look at George. He did not look at the crowd. He looked only at me. And when he reached me, he did something no one expected. He untied the rope, he dropped it in the mud, and he said quietly, so only I could hear, "You will never wear a rope again, not while I breathe." I did not know his name. I did not know that his full title was Alexander James Hartley, 7th Duke of Ravenswick, the richest man in the north of England. I did not know that he owned 11,000 acres, 400 tenants, and a house so large it had its own chapel, its own lake, and its own name on the map. I did not know any of this. All I knew was that a stranger had paid £5 for me, untied the rope, and spoken to me like I was a person. But we must go back to the beginning. Back to how a vicar's daughter ended up on an auction block with a rope on her wrist and mud on her only good dress. My name is Rosalind. I was born in the village of Thornbury, in the county of Gloucestershire, in a stone vicarage that smelled of old hymn books and lavender. My father, Reverend Edmund Cole, was a good man, gentle, learned, and so deeply impractical that he once gave away our winter firewood to a family who already had plenty, simply because they asked nicely. My mother died when I was 9. After that, I became the vicarage. I cooked, cleaned, mended, tended the garden, managed the accounts my father could not manage, and read every book in his modest library twice. I was not beautiful, not in the way that songs describe. I had brown hair that refused to hold a curl, gray eyes that people called serious, and hands that were always slightly ink-stained from writing sermons. My father forgot to write himself. But I was content. I had my books, my garden, my father's absent-minded kindness, and a quiet life that asked nothing of me but competence. That ended when I was 21. My father died on a Tuesday in March. Quietly, in his sleep, with a half-finished sermon on his desk about the parable of the mustard seed. He was 58. The bishop sent a new vicar within the month. I was given 14 days to leave the only home I had ever known. I had no money, no relatives, no prospects. A vicar's daughter with ink-stained fingers and a talent for Greek translation does not attract suitors in a Gloucestershire village. And so when George Bly, a tenant farmer with 40 acres, a decent house, and a face that was handsome enough when he was sober, offered marriage, I said yes. I said yes because the alternative was the workhouse. I said yes because he smiled when he proposed and his hands were gentle when he helped me into his cart. I said yes because I was 21. Alone, afraid, and stupid in the way that only desperate people can be stupid. I mistook relief for love and silence for kindness. The first 6 months were tolerable. George was not cruel, merely indifferent. He wanted a wife who could cook, clean, manage the household, keep the hens, mend his shirts, and not speak unless spoken to. I could do all of these things. I had been doing them since I was 9. The trouble began when he started drinking. It was not sudden. It crept in like damp through stone walls, a pint at the Ploughman after market day. 2 pints. 3. Then a bottle of gin on the mantelpiece that was full on Monday and empty by Wednesday. The drinking changed him. The indifference became irritation. The irritation became anger. And the anger, I will not describe what the anger became. You can imagine it. Every woman who has lived with a man like George can imagine it. I will say only this. Within a year, I had learned to sleep with one eye open, to flinch at the sound of boots on stone, and to hide the kitchen knife under the mattress, not to use but to know it was there. By the 2nd year, George had drunk through his savings, gambled away one of his fields, and owed money to every tavern between Thornbury and Bristol. He looked at me the way a drowning man looks at anything that might float. "You're worth something," he said one evening, studying me from his chair by the fire. "Not much, but something." I did not understand what he meant. Not until the morning he woke me before dawn, handed me my only clean dress, and said, "Put this on. We're going to Chipping Sodbury. There's a market." Wife sales in Regency England were a poor man's divorce. A husband would lead his wife to market, literally with a halter or rope around her wrist, as though she were livestock, and auction her to the highest bidder. The practice was ancient, widespread, and perfectly understood by everyone involved. The authorities tolerated it, the church condemned it but did nothing. And the women, well, the women did what women have always done. They survived. Some women went willingly. Some had arranged the sale themselves, choosing a lover or a kinder man to buy them and set them free. Some women were dragged. I was not dragged. I walked beside George in silence because I had learned, over 2 years, that silence was the safest language. The market at Chipping Sodbury was bustling, livestock, grain, cloth, tools, the ordinary commerce of rural England spread across the cobblestones. George led me to the far end of the square where a wooden platform had been erected. An auctioneer, a squat man with ginger whiskers and a voice like a foghorn, stood ready. There were 2 other women before me. One went for £3 to a butcher who looked kind enough. The other went for £1.12 to an old farmer who needed someone to tend his dying mother. Both women walked away dry-eyed. This was business. This was survival. Then it was my turn. George tied the rope loosely around my left wrist. "Smile," he hissed. "You look like a funeral." I did not smile. The auctioneer called his patter. The crowd stared, and the silence stretched like a held breath because no one bid. I understood. I was too thin, too quiet, too serious. My hands were rough, my dress was faded, and I had the look of a woman who had been hungry more often than not. I was not the kind of purchase that excited men. The silence became unbearable. George's face reddened. He had expected at least £2 or £3, enough for a week's drinking, and then £5. The voice from the back, the stranger in the brown coat. £5 was outrageous. £5 was more than any wife had sold for at Chipping Sodbury in living memory. £5 was a provocation, a statement, a declaration. George practically threw the rope at the stranger. The stranger caught it, looked at it, and dropped it in the mud, as I have already described. What I have not described, what I could not have known until much later, is what happened in the moments before that bid. The stranger had been watching, not from the back of the crowd, as I had thought, but from the window of the inn above the square, where he had been sitting for an hour, drinking coffee and reading a letter from his steward. He had not come to the market to buy a wife. He had come to inspect a canal route for a business investment. But he had seen me led onto the platform with a rope on my wrist. He had seen my face, not crying, not pleading, not broken, but completely, furiously still. The stillness of a woman who has decided that she will not give the world the satisfaction of seeing her pain. And he had put down his coffee, walked downstairs, and bid £5. His name, as I would learn, was Lord Benedict Ashford. But he did not tell me that. Not yet. He told me his name was Ben, and that he had a farm 30 miles north, and that I was welcome to come with him or go free, as I chose. "You bought me," I said. I did not know I had a choice. You do now, he said. I went with him. Not because I trusted him. I had long since stopped trusting men, but because 30 miles north was 30 miles away from George Bly, and that was worth any risk. He took me to a small stone cottage at the edge of a village called Netherbrook. The cottage was clean, simple, and comfortable. Whitewashed walls, a kitchen garden already planted, a bedroom with a real feather bed and clean linen, and a sitting room with a shelf of books that made my heart ache with longing. "This is yours," he said, setting down my small bag. "There is food in the pantry, wood for the fire, and a lock on the door. The key is yours. No one enters without your permission, including me." I stared at him. "Where will you sleep?" "I have lodgings at the inn in the village," he said. "I will come by in the morning to see if you need anything." "If you would prefer I did not leave a white cloth on the gate." He turned to go. "Wait," I said. "Why?" He paused at the door. "Why what? Why did you buy me? Why this cottage? Why the books? Why are you being kind?" He looked at me for a long moment. His winter-sea eyes were unreadable but not cold. There was something in them, something careful, something patient, something that looked like it had been waiting a very long time. "Because someone should have been kind to you a long time ago," he said. "Good night, Rosalind." He knew my name. I had not told him my name. He was gone before I could ask how. The weeks that followed were the strangest of my life. Ben came every morning at 9. He brought fresh bread from the village baker, eggs from a farm down the lane, and, without fail, a single book from a collection I never saw, poetry one day, natural philosophy the next, a novel by Miss Austen, a treatise on botany, each one chosen with uncanny precision for my tastes, as though he had catalogued my mind before he ever spoke to me. He never entered the cottage uninvited. He sat on the garden bench while I made tea, and we talked through the open kitchen window about books, about the weather, about the quality of the soil in the garden, about anything and everything except the two questions that burned in my chest. Who are you? And why are you doing this? I learned things about him in fragments. He knew Latin and Greek, not the rough schoolboy Greek of a country education, but the flowing musical Greek of a man who had read Homer for pleasure. He knew the names of every plant in the hedgerow. He could calculate the yield of a wheat field by looking at it. His hands were not a farmer's hands. They were too clean, too precise, but he moved through the countryside with the ease of a man who belonged to the land. He was also, I noticed, frequently visited by well-dressed men on horseback who arrived, spoke to him urgently in low voices, and departed. He explained these away as business associates. I did not believe him. By the 6th week, I was falling in love with him. I hated myself for it. I had fallen before, or thought I had, and it had ended with a rope on my wrist and a husband who sold me like a sack of grain. Love, in my experience, was a trap with teeth, but Ben was not George. Ben listened when I spoke. Ben laughed at my jokes, truly laughed, with his whole face, which transformed from guarded beauty into something radiant and boyish. Ben brought me a kitten when I mentioned I missed having a cat. Ben mended the garden gate himself in the rain, because he noticed it was crooked. One evening in late November, the first frost came. I was sitting by the fire reading when there was a knock at the door. It was Ben, soaked through, holding a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. "I brought you a winter coat," he said. "Mrs. Pennywhistle at the village shop says it is the warmest she has." "Come inside," I said. "You'll catch your death." He hesitated. In 6 weeks he had never crossed the threshold. "I have tea," I said, "and I made soup." He came inside, he sat by my fire, he drank my tea, and for the first time the careful distance between us collapsed into something warm and dangerous and alive. "Ben," I said, "I need to ask you something." "Ask? Who are you, really?" He set down his cup. He looked at the fire for a long time, and then he said, "I will tell you, but not tonight. Tonight, I want to be the man who brings you a coat and sits by your fire and pretends that this ordinary, quiet, perfect evening is the whole of the world." I let him pretend, because I wanted to pretend too. He slept on the chair by the fire that night. I covered him with a blanket. And in the morning he was gone, and on the kitchen table he had left a note. "Thank you for the soup. It was the finest meal I have ever had, B." The truth came, as it always does, uninvited. It was December, and I was cleaning the cottage when I found a letter wedged behind the bookshelf. It had slipped there, accidentally, I think, from a coat pocket. The envelope was heavy cream paper. the kind that costs more than my monthly food. The seal was deep blue wax, stamped with a crest I did not recognize, a raven holding a sword with the motto Fortis et Fidelis, strong and faithful. The letter was addressed to His Grace, Alexander James Hartley, 7th Duke of Ravenswick, Ravenswick Park, Northumberland. I read it 3 times. His Grace, Duke, Ravenswick. Ben was not Ben. Ben was not a farmer. Ben was the Duke of Ravenswick. I sat on the floor of the cottage with the letter in my lap and my world rewriting itself around me. Every kindness, every conversation, every careful morning visit, all of it refracted through this single devastating fact. A duke had bought me at a wife auction. A duke had given me a cottage and books and a kitten and a winter coat. A duke had sat by my fire and drunk my soup and called it the finest meal he had ever had. Why? The question was no longer charming. It was terrifying. Was I a charity project? A curiosity? A game? Rich men collected things, paintings, horses, rare books. Did the Duke of Ravenswick collect women from auction blocks the way other men collected snuff boxes? I put the letter back behind the bookshelf. I put on my coat, and I hung a white cloth on the gate. He did not come the next day, or the day after. On the 3rd day, I found a note slipped under the door. I see the cloth. I will respect your wishes, but please know, whatever you have learned, whatever you think of me, everything I told you was true. My name may not be Ben, but every word I spoke to you as Ben was honest. I am, as I have always been yours to command. A signed A, not B.A. for Alexander. On the 7th day of silence, a carriage I recognized pulled into the village. It was not Ben's, Alexander's carriage. It was George Bly's borrowed cart, and George Bly was in it, drunk, furious, and looking for me. I learned later how he found me. George had spent his £5 within a week. Gin, gambling, a woman in Bristol who took the last of it. Broke and bitter, he had begun asking questions. Who was the stranger who paid £5 for his wife? Where had he taken her? Someone told him the direction. Someone else told him the village. George, being George, drew the worst possible conclusions and decided that I was living in luxury while he rotted in poverty, that I had somehow cheated him, that £5 was too little, that he deserved more. He arrived at the cottage at dusk. I was alone. The fire was lit. The door was locked. He hammered on the door. Rosalind, open this door. You're still my wife by law, you hear me? I'll have the constable on you. I'll have your fancy man arrested for theft of a man's property. I pressed my back against the door and said nothing. My hands were shaking. The old fear, the boot-on stone, flinch in the dark fear flooded through me like poison. I know you're in there, he roared. Open this door or I'll break it down. He meant it. George always meant it. I reached for the kitchen knife under the mattress, the one I had brought from the old house, the one I had never used but always kept close. And then hoofbeats. Fast, thundering hoofbeats on the lane. A horse pulled up outside, a door slammed, and a voice, not loud, not shouting, but carrying the unmistakable authority of a man who has never in his life been disobeyed, said, "Step away from that door." I opened the window curtain a crack. Alexander Ben stood in the lane. He was no longer in his plain brown coat. He wore riding clothes of finest black wool, polished boots, and a riding crop that he held loosely in one gloved hand. Behind him, 2 men on horseback, his men clearly, waited in the shadows. George turned, swaying. "Who the hell are you?" "I am the Duke of Ravenswick," Alexander said, "and you are trespassing on my land, threatening a woman under my protection, and testing the very last thread of my patience. I suggest you get back in your cart and leave. Now." George's face went white. Even drunk, even stupid, even George Bly could recognize that tone. The tone of a man who owned the ground you stood on, the air you breathed, and the magistrate who would decide your fate. She's my wife," George stammered. "She was your wife," Alexander said. "You sold her. I have 70 witnesses. You accepted payment. The transaction is complete. She is a free woman, and if you come within 5 miles of her again, I will have you arrested, prosecuted, and transported. Do I make myself clear?" George looked at me through the window. I looked back. And for the first time in 3 years, I was not afraid of him. He got in his cart. He left. He would be back, of course. Men like George always come back. But not tonight. Alexander stood in the lane for a long time after George's cart disappeared. He did not approach the cottage. He did not knock. I opened the door. "You came," I said. I never left, he said. I have been at the inn every night since you hung the white cloth. I was waiting. For what? For you to need me, or to tell me to go forever, whichever came first. I stepped aside. Come inside, I said. We need to talk. We sat by the fire and he told me everything. His name was Alexander James Hartley. He was 30 years old. He was the 7th Duke of Ravenswick, one of the oldest titles in England. His estate, Ravenswick Park, was a house of 200 rooms in the Northumberland countryside, with 11,000 acres, a lake, a deer park, 3 villages, and an annual income of £40,000. He was by any measure one of the most powerful men in England. He was also, he said quietly, the loneliest. I inherited the title at 22 when my father died, he said. I have spent 8 years being hunted by every matchmaking mother in the country. They parade their daughters before me like horses at a fair. Blonde ones, brunette ones, accomplished ones, beautiful ones, all of them performing, all of them calculating, all of them seeing nothing but the title and the income in the house. And you wanted someone who did not see those things, I said. I wanted someone who was real. He told me how he had found me. 6 months before the auction, he had been traveling through Gloucestershire on business. His carriage had thrown a wheel near Thornbury, and while his driver repaired it, he had walked into the village. He had seen me at the market, not doing anything remarkable, just buying turnips, arguing with the grocer about the price with a dry, sharp wit that made the old man laugh. My dress was patched. My shoes were worn. My hands were red from work, and I was reading a book while walking, a Latin grammar, held open with one hand while the other carried a basket. You were magnificent, he said, not because you were beautiful, though you are, but because you were completely unapologetically yourself. In a world where every woman I met was performing a role, you were simply you. He had asked the grocer who I was, learned my name, learned my situation, the dead father, the bad husband, the debts. He had returned to Northumberland and tried to forget me. He could not. When his steward told him about the canal investment near Chipping Sodbury, he had gone himself, hoping perhaps to see me again. And he had found me on an auction block with a rope on my wrist. I did not plan any of this, he said. I did not plan the cottage or the books or the mornings. I only knew that I could not leave you in that square with that rope on your wrist and that man's hands on your life. The rest happened because you are you, and I cannot seem to stop wanting to be near you. I was crying. I had not cried in 2 years. Not when George hit me, not when he sold me, not when I stood on that platform in silence. But I cried now because kindness, when it comes after cruelty, is the sharpest blade of all. I am a bought woman, I whispered. A sold wife. I have nothing. No name, no money, no reputation. Half of England would say I'm still George Blythe's property. How can a duke marry a woman he bought at auction? Alexander took my hands. His eyes, winter sea gray, held mine with an intensity that stopped my breath. I did not buy you, he said. I bought your freedom. What you do with it is yours to decide. If you want to stay in this cottage and read books and grow turnips for the rest of your life, I will make sure no one ever troubles you again. If you want to go to London, to Edinburgh, to Paris, I will arrange it. He paused. And if you want to come to Ravenswick Park and be my wife, not because I bought you, not because you owe me, not because you have nowhere else to go, but because you choose me as I have chosen you, then I will spend every day of my life making sure you never regret it. I said yes, not immediately. Not the way I said yes to George, out of desperation, grasping at survival. I said yes 3 weeks later, on Christmas morning, after 21 days of thinking, reading, walking in the frost, and asking myself the only question that mattered. Do you love him, or do you love being safe? The answer was both, and I decided that both was allowed. The journey to Ravenswick Park took 3 days by carriage. I expected a grand house. I expected servants and gardens and the polished machinery of aristocratic life. I was not prepared for what I saw. Ravenswick Park was not a house. It was a kingdom, a palace of pale golden stone that rose from the Northumberland hills like something dreamed rather than built. 200 rooms. A great hall with a ceiling painted with angels, a library containing 12,000 volumes, a lake so still it doubled the sky, gardens that stretched to the horizon, and everywhere, on every gate, every door, every piece of silver, the raven crest and the motto, Fortis et Fidelis, strong and faithful. I stood in the entrance hall in my faded sage green dress, the same dress I had worn on the auction block, and 200 servants bowed. "Welcome home, Your Grace," said Mrs. Fairfax, the housekeeper, a tall, dignified woman with silver hair and kind eyes. "Your Grace. They called me Your Grace." I looked at Alexander. He stood beside me in his plain brown coat, the one he had worn at the auction, and his eyes were shining. "What do you think?" he asked. "I think," I said carefully, "that you are going to have to explain the coat." He laughed. The sound filled the great hall like music. We married in the Ravenswick Chapel on the 2nd day of January, 1823. The ceremony was small, Alexander's wish, not mine. He wanted no spectacle, no society, no parade of guests who would whisper about the auction and the rope and the £5. Just us, the vicar, Mrs. Fairfax as witness, and a vase of winter roses. It was the most beautiful day of my life, but paradise, as I should have learned by now, has a very short lease. The trouble came in the form of Lady Clarissa Ashworth, Alexander's cousin, a woman of 35 with a sharp tongue, sharper ambitions, and a face that would have been beautiful if cruelty did not live so close to the surface. Lady Clarissa had expected to inherit Ravenswick. She was Alexander's nearest relative, his late mother's niece, and for 8 years she had positioned herself as the inevitable Duchess, managing the household, hosting dinner parties, advising Alexander on estate matters, and systematically discouraging every potential bride who came within 10 miles. She had not anticipated a wife auction in Gloucestershire. "You married a purchased woman," Clarissa said to Alexander at dinner, 3 days after the wedding. Her voice was silk over steel. "A tenant farmer's discarded wife, a woman bought with a halter on her wrist like a heifer at a country fair. What do you imagine society will say?" "I imagine society will say a great many things," Alexander replied calmly, "as it always does, and I imagine I will care about their opinions exactly as much as I always have, which is to say, not at all." But Clarissa was not finished. She was patient, methodical, and poisonous, the kind of villain who does not attack with a sword but with 1,000 tiny cuts. Over the following weeks, she launched her campaign. She told the servants that I was an imposter, a common woman playing at Duchess, unfit to manage a household of 200. She wrote letters to society hostesses across the north, describing my origins in lurid detail. She invited Alexander's business associates to dinner and seated me beside the most condescending, the most snobbish, the most deliberately cruel, watching with satisfaction as they spoke over me, around me, through me, as though I were furniture. And she found George, I do not know how. Perhaps she hired someone to investigate my past. Perhaps George came to her. He was cunning enough, when sober, to recognize an opportunity. However it happened, 6 weeks after my wedding, George Bly arrived at Ravenswick Park with a solicitor and a claim. The sale was illegal. The solicitor announced in Alexander's study, "A wife's sale carries no legal standing. Mrs. Bly, not the Duchess of Ravenswick, is still the lawful wife of Mr. George Bly. This marriage is bigamous. The Duke has committed a criminal offense." Clarissa stood behind them, smiling. Alexander did not panic. He looked at George. He looked at the solicitor. He looked at Clarissa, and he said very quietly, "Sit down. All of you, I have something to show you." He opened a drawer in his desk and removed a leather portfolio. From it, he produced a sheaf of documents, each one sealed, signed, and witnessed. "Document 1, he said. "A formal deed of separation, signed by Mr. George Bly on the 14th of October, 1822, in the presence of 3 witnesses, surrendering all marital rights and claims in exchange for the sum of £5. Legally binding under common law precedent." George went pale. "I did not sign. You did. You signed it in front of the auctioneer and 2 magistrates I had positioned in the crowd. You were too drunk to read it. That is not my problem." "Document 2, Alexander continued. "An affidavit from the Reverend Mr. Holloway of Chipping Sodbury, attesting that he observed Mr. Bly voluntarily and publicly relinquish his wife, and that Mrs. Bly entered into freedom of her own will." Document 3. A formal annulment petition, filed with the ecclesiastical court 6 weeks ago on grounds of Mr. Bly's documented history of cruelty, drunkenness, and abandonment. The annulment was granted 3 days ago. I received confirmation this morning. He laid the final document on the desk. "My wife's marriage to you, Mr. Bly, no longer exists. It has been annulled by the church and dissolved by the courts. Rosalind is free. She has been free since the moment I untied that rope." The room was silent. Alexander turned to Clarissa. Cousin, I am aware of every letter you have written, every whisper you have planted, every servant you have turned against my wife. I have been aware of it since the second week. Clarissa's smile vanished. You will leave Ravenswick Park by tomorrow morning. You will receive a quarterly allowance sufficient for a comfortable life because you are family, and I do not abandon family, even when family abandons me. But you will not return to this house, you will not contact my wife, and you will not speak of her origins to anyone ever again. If you do, the allowance stops, and I will make sure every hostess in England knows exactly why. Clarissa left that night. She did not wait until morning. George was escorted off the estate by 2 of Alexander's men. He was given £10, more than you deserve and more than she was ever worth to you, and told that if he came within 20 miles of Ravenswick again, he would be arrested for trespassing, harassment, and fraud. He took the money. Of course he did. I stood in the doorway of the study and watched them go, and when the last carriage had disappeared down the long drive, Alexander came to stand beside me. You planned this from the beginning? I said. The witnesses, the deed of separation, the annulment. I planned for every possibility, he said. I could not protect you from what had already happened, but I could make sure no one ever used it against you again. You are terrifying, I said, only when someone threatens the people I love. I looked at him, this man who had seen me buying turnips in a village market, who had bought my freedom with £5 and his patience, who had waited 6 weeks for me to stop being afraid, who had fought a war I never even saw to make sure I was safe. Alexander, I said, yes. The soup really was not that good. He laughed until he cried, It is spring now. I'm writing this in the library at Ravenswick Park, the library with 12,000 books, all of which I intend to read. The fire is low, the windows are open to the garden, and somewhere outside I can hear Alexander arguing with the gardener about roses. My hand rests on my belly. There is a child coming, our child, due in the autumn, when the Northumberland hills turn gold and the raven crest catches the last of the summer light. I still have the faded sage-green dress. It hangs in the back of my wardrobe behind the silks and the satins and the velvet evening gowns that Mrs. Fairfax insists a duchess must own. I keep it not as a reminder of suffering, but as proof that survival is its own kind of victory. Sometimes in the quiet hours before dawn, I think about the woman on the auction block, the woman with the rope on her wrist and the mud on her shoes and the silence that she wore like armor. I think about what she would say if she could see me now, sitting in a library the size of a cathedral, married to a man who loves her, carrying a child safe, warm, free. I think she would say, you deserve this. All of it. Every single page. And she would be right.